paint robots, and why you choose the robot as sort of a dominant character in your paintings.
I paint robots first and foremost just because they're just an enjoyable subject matter for me. I've always been fascinated by that kind of 50s sci-fi, Robbie the Robot. I grew up on Star Wars. I first started painting robots because of a couple other artists, specifically Phil Hale and John Foster, both illustrators, and very talented individuals. Became very enamored of what they were doing and kind of wanted to go along that same vein and started doing them myself. And they, though inspired by their works, kind of took on their own personality, and I suppose they took on my personality. Robots became an avatar of every man. I specifically started this series with a rule set in mind. The main component of that being that each painting would have a single robot in them. Each robot would have a very specific personality, a very specific kind of story behind him. The second main component is that though there would be signs of human life, factories and structures and even stuff going on in the background, I would never paint any people into the paintings, because as soon as you put a person into a painting, the painting kind of becomes about that person. And I wanted these robots, this experience that they're having, and more often than not, the experience is this awakening of life in them, this idea that they have somehow just gained consciousness, and the joys and also the pitfalls of developing an identity, of developing that idea of self. These situations that I'm putting these robots into are often kind of dire and macabre, and if I were to do that to a real person, or to illustrate that using a real person, people I think would be more turned off by the act itself rather than, for instance, having a robot plumbing into the ground at 80 miles an hour. Kind of funny and poignant, and people can understand the situation, but doing the same thing to a person is just rude.
What the significance of the numbers are?
For the robots specifically, the numbers have a very specific meaning. They are all part of a series, and so the number designates their place in the series. There's going to be 100 of them, therefore 100 numbers. Each robot has a different number. But numbers in general fall into a kind of a psychological trigger. I use a lot of similar triggers with fish and birds and wings and other recognizable objects. I like to use these triggers to get people involved in the painting. The process of art, I think, happens when a viewer goes into a painting and tries to figure out what's going on in there, rather than just observing it. They're becoming part of that process. And the numbers are there just to kind of help them get something that they're familiar with to hang on to. They don't really have any significant meaning other than they are very familiar to people, and they just create a little catch to pique people's curiosity. I believe that all artists are going to have their own visual vocabulary. We all are creating images that are, in no small part, pieces of ourselves. And so my use of all these elements is obvious that I have a kind of a kinship with these things. There are specific reasons for each of them. The fish I find very fascinating. I've always been fascinated by fish. I think they are just incredible creatures, and they live in a world that is completely outside of our own, and yet at the same time, they're very familiar to people, to me, and so they have this really incredible dichotomy. Teeth are just plain frightening when they're just disembodied from the head. They just kind of have a cool vibe to them, and I tend to put wings and eyeballs on a lot of stuff, and it really is just a way of of taking the ordinary and making it extraordinary.
Do you ever keep the sort of archetypal symbolism in mind, or are you purely functioning from your own set of symbology?
No, I do tend to use a lot of archetypal symbology, specifically religious symbology. I was raised very secular, but at the same time I came to understand that religious iconography has incredible potency to it. And so I try to incorporate a lot of that into my artwork. I use a lot of telephone poles, and it's a really clever way to get a real subtle crucifix into the painting. The fish, of course, represented Jesus, and people are going to naturally be inclined towards those things and have a much stronger reaction to them, which I think is important, again, in the process of the art, that people become very attached to something and even if they're coming up with their own interpretations, they are taking part in that process, and the stronger that I can make that connection with them, the stronger the art's going to be at the end.